Hey folks, welcome back to this week's chapter and continued exploration, I should say, of The Story by Randy Frazee and our trip on through as we continue to explore the biblical narrative. This week we are looking at chapter 9, which is entitled The Faith of a Foreign Woman. This chapter is an interesting one in that it is actually featuring the entirety of a book of the Bible, and that specific book is the Old Testament or Hebrew book of Ruth or story of Ruth. Ruth itself within the scripture is only 4 chapters long. It's really not very long at all. You may have noticed that in the reading of this chapter. It was only a few pages. It really wasn't very long. And we find it placed between the book of Judges and between the book of 1 Samuel. Now, the setting of Ruth, time-wise, it's set during the period of Judges or the same period of Judges. So it's somewhere in that general timeline from what we read last week. Ruth is actually the great grandmother of David, who would go on to be the second king of Israel. David was the son of Jesse, who was the son of Obed, who was the son of Boaz and Ruth, as we hear in the chapter. She's also one of only about 4 or maybe 5 women who are mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus, which we find in Matthew chapter 1, because of her descendant being David, and Jesus was a descendant of David. So therefore, on down the line, she's one of only a couple of women or a few women that are mentioned. Now, doing some estimates here, if we estimate approximately 20 years per generation, and again, this is approximate, and this is only an estimate, she would have been around about 60 years before the birth of Jesus. Again, not Jesus, excuse me, David. But again, this is an estimate. David became king approximately the year 1000 BC. So this story would take place somewhere in the vicinity-ish of about 1050 to maybe 1100 years before Jesus was around. Again, ish, that's just an estimate. There's really only 2 sections of this story, and it's really just kind of one story. Honestly, I think it's kind of just one section. But we have the introduction to the various characters that we hear about, specifically Naomi and Ruth, also Orpah, who's the other daughter-in-law of Naomi. And interestingly enough, something I hadn't really thought about prior to this time around is that in a lot of ways, the story actually seems to center more around Naomi even than it does Ruth. But that's a lot of what's going on. And in the first section, we really kind of hear about the hardships that she faces. Now, the second section is their eventual return to the region of Israel, where really Naomi's from, her and Ruth. And they go back to Naomi's people, which is the clan of her husband, and the encounters between Ruth and Boaz that will result in eventual care for the women and the expansion of family for the 2 women as well. So that's kind of the 2 sections. But again, it's only 4 chapters long in terms of the scripture. So it's really kind of all just one story. There's also evidence of a lot of cultural realities. And this is a lot of what really jumped at me in terms of some important things for the story. So first of all, Ruth is a Moabite, aka she is a Gentile. She is not Jewish, even though Naomi is. Orpah also is, but again, Orpah is pretty minor in the story. Both of Naomi's sons, had therefore married outside the Jewish culture, which they weren't really supposed to do, but as we've heard in different situations, it was becoming quite common. So it did happen, even though they weren't supposed to. Also, another notch against Ruth in this situation, Moabites were considered especially bad, and this dates back to some of the time of the wilderness wanderings when the Moabites and the Israelites really butted heads, and there was an attempt at them working together, and the Moabites didn't want to do that, so Moabites equal really, really bad. That's essentially where we're starting. When Naomi's husband and then her 2 sons all die, Naomi tries to send her 2 daughters-in-law, the 2 women, Ruth and Orpah. She tries to send them to go home, go back to your father's house, where hopefully you can remarry again. Now, this is all a portion, or kind of speaks to the Jewish consideration or the Jewish expectation that when a husband died, is the expectation that that man's brother would marry the widow and carry on the family and essentially have children with the widow on behalf of his brother. That is the idea there. Now, this is why Naomi says, even if I was to marry today and have more sons, would you wait for them to be grown? That was kind of some of that aspect that goes in there. There's also echoes of this in the later part of the story when we hear about the kinsman redeemer and Boaz as they're discussing the purchase of Naomi's property, or actually the property of her dead husband, and the subsequent acceptance of Ruth and the marriage of Ruth. Now, both of these individuals, the kinsman redeemer, whoever that is, and then Boaz, they are very likely relatives of Naomi or of her husband from within the clan. Could be, maybe they're his brother or a cousin or a nephew or an uncle, kind of as the family tree sort of branches out, these would be considered like the first and second closest males that would be expected then to honor the memory of their dead relatives by redeeming the land and keeping it in the dead man's name, and also marrying the widow and carrying on children with that. So again, all of this is kind of out there in the ether in terms of cultural expectations. Another cultural expectation, and this dates all the way back to Moses and the law, is this idea of when you harvest, you leave some behind. You leave some along the edges to be gleaned by the widows and the orphans as a way for the most vulnerable within the community or within the culture to be cared for. Now, we hear about that. That is referenced in this as Boaz is talking about the women who are coming along and gleaning, including Ruth. And so that's what is going on there. But there's also a danger for her in this regard because she is a foreigner and she is alone. Even though Naomi has sent her, she is alone in this. And so there's a danger to her. And I think that's why Boaz asks, has anyone messed with her, and tells his servants, don't mess with her. Just let her do her thing. Let her go with that. But that's kind of some of the cultural things that are going on there. But again, and I already mentioned this, but it does sort of stick with me throughout the story. It does continue seemingly to orbit around Naomi, and her perspective changes from the beginning of the story to the end. At first it's the Lord has made my life bitter, to the Lord has blessed me and shown favor to me through these various events that are going on. And that's interesting, just to consider the ways that she feels downtrodden because everything's working seemingly stacked against her and her daughter-in-law, and then yet through the favor of God, they're eventually cared for. This raises a question. Who is this story really about? Or what is this story really about? And I'm not going to propose it's any one or the other, but here's some possibilities. And I'll leave this to you to think about. Is this about the Israelite culture accepting Gentiles into the community, into the culture? Maybe we can make that argument. Is this about God's faithfulness to the marginalized? Ruth as a foreigner, Naomi as a widow with no support, also Ruth as a widow from that regard, and the ways that they are called to be cared for. Is this about God's favor being upon them both as they are resources for one another? Naomi knows how to navigate this culture where Ruth now finds herself, and Ruth is a foreigner in this. Ruth does the work to provide for them both by going out and actually getting the food and such, and getting the grain to provide for them. So we kind of have this back and forth ways that they are both bringing something to the table in that regard. So that's a lot of what's going on. Now let's get into the problematic stuff, because I'm going to talk about the problematic stuff. While this story does feature eventual favor for the two women, I think it also illustrates how this society is not geared towards them, or is not built to favor them. They are at the mercy of men, those fellow clansmen who could honor the expectation and care for them and redeem that property and marry the women or not. And they are kind of at the mercy of all the men around them. Now, do things seemingly go favorably? Yes, they do. But this is all evidence of the ways that the deck was really stacked against them at the time. Now, here's the other thing that's interesting. I kind of raise an eyebrow at this, and I will leave this open to your interpretation. I just want to present this as something that I have read and something that makes me go, Scholars have proposed that some of the events of this story could be considered euphemism, particularly the events around the threshing floor when Boaz has eaten and drank and is merry, aka he's probably gone to bed drunk, and he's sleeping there on the threshing floor. Now we hear about the Ruth uncovering his feet, and that probably doesn't really mean feet. And then when Boaz covers her with the blanket, there that probably wasn't limited to just physical sleep going on. So all of this, I'm not saying it did happen. I'm not saying it didn't happen. Scholars have proposed this, and it does raise that question of what maybe was going on. And if that is the case, I find myself wondering, did Boaz feel cornered? Was he feeling coerced? Was he now protecting his honor as well as trying to protect her honor? Was he forced to support Ruth and Naomi's claims through the redemption and the marriage because of what may or may not have happened? And again, I'm not saying it did. I'm not saying it didn't. I'm just raising questions. And also in doing so, I want to be clear about this too. I'm also not trying to cast any shade at Ruth or Naomi for that matter either. Rather just acknowledging possible cultural challenges and realities in and around a story that we are told and we don't really know all the details. And we aren't 100% familiar with all of the cultural expectations and cultural realities. So that's some of the stuff that I kind of think about. I wonder what's going on there, but I'll leave that open to you to discuss. Hope you have a great discussion, and we'll be ready next time. Next time we move into the events in and around Samuel, who was the last judge and a prophet, and then the transfer into the idea of kings with the first king of Israel, aka King Saul. Catch you later.